This is an exciting time in Scotland's story, and understanding our past will help us determine our future. And when Scotland's voice is heard, it charts the way forward. This is Scotland Speaks with Salmond.
Welcome to Scotland Speaks with Salmond on Saturday morning here at 10 a.m. in our usual place.
Before the international football break.
Before the international football break, and we thought, given the success of the last 2 week shows, which of course were long because they were a replay of the excellent show we had at the IMAX cinema in Glasgow, we today would produce some of our best bits from the show. Well, first up in the IMAX cinema, we had seasoned broadcaster Bernard Ponsonby.
Now this was something of a role reversal, not the sort of role reversal so beloved of the Scottish Parliament. This was a role reversal of broadcaster being interviewed instead of being the interviewer. I've waited 35 years to do this, and this is how it turned out. Broadcaster, Mr. Bernard Ponsonby.
Yay!
So the SNP end up busting the system in 2011. Your expectations then, was there going to be a referendum? Was it inevitable under these circumstances? And were you surprised by the referendum that emerged in terms of the Scottish Parliament controlling the question, the franchise, etc.?
I wasn't surprised at all, because I did not get the sense from any Westminster politician at that particular point, in the context of that time, that they were going to do anything but grant the referendum. I remember doing several interviews with David Cameron, in which it was perfectly clear that they almost welcomed the fact that there was going to be a referendum. And one of the reasons why I think he welcomed the fact is that he couldn't countenance under any circumstances that this would be remotely close. And I think that the mistake that the unionist parties made in the run-up to this, and constitutional referenda, in a sense, are not perfect barometers. And they're not perfect barometers for this reason. They invite a response to a binary question, which invariably invites an emotional response to a pretty complicated set of circumstances. I think that's one of the problems, and that was, again, evidenced during the course of the Brexit referendum. And I think that the mistake that they made is that they painted themselves into a corner, or backed themselves into a corner, where there was no offer. And if you have a situation in a referendum where there is no change versus change, there's always a section of the country that's impatient with their lot, who will say that change is actually quite a good thing. Had the choice, for example, rather than come out with the vow, not at the 11th hour, but beyond the 11th hour, had there been a choice between more powers spelled out and independence, the result and the dynamics may well have been different. But it didn't surprise me that after 2011 and to 2014, that the support for yes really did turbocharge. I think it was in the late 20s, 28, 29, ends up at 45. And I think the lesson that they should have learned is that if you box yourself into a corner as being a movement of no change, you dice with death.
Now, next up, Tasmina was introducing 3 quite remarkable female politicians, all people who were attracted into politics as a result of that referendum campaign of 10 years ago.
And as we turned to the summer of 2014 and the many groups that blossomed in that period of time, we thought it'd be great to speak to Joanna Cherry KC of Lawyers for Yes, Dr. Philippa Whitford of NHS for Yes, and Michelle Thompson, who was pivotal in the Business for Scotland, Business for Yes campaign. Here's what they had to say when interviewed by myself at the IMAX. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Joanna Cherry, KC, Dr. Philippa Whitford and Michelle Thompson, MSP.
So it was really important to bring your life experience, what you feel the society in Scotland had already gained, but what would be an offer, and particularly protecting what we have gained. You can only control the future if the future's in your hands. And that was the main argument. If the NHS, if health, if well-being are important to you, you want to have control over them. And that's what we didn't have, and sadly what we don't have at the moment.
Most people are busy getting on with their lives, and most people in Scotland, as in the whole of the United Kingdom at the moment, are facing some pretty big challenges in their lives because of the cost of living crisis and high interest rates, high mortgages, high rents. And so it is the responsibility of political leadership. And I don't just mean an individual. There isn't a messiah. Leadership should be, well, there isn't a messiah in political terms, and it is childish and fatuous to put all your hopes in one individual. We need more collegiate leadership, but we need proper leadership. But I do want to sound a note of caution, because I knocked a lot of doors during the general election campaign, and I can tell you I met very few people whose priority was independence. People had other priorities, and we need to recognise that. I'm not saying forget about independence, but we need to recognise that. And in addition to having other priorities at the moment, they don't trust the Scottish National Party in government any longer. That's a huge difference. That's the huge difference from 2014. Now, in some ways, it's inevitable that a party that's been in power for 17 years should look rather tired. But there's a bit more to it than that, as we all know. So in order to win the prize of independence, we need strong political leadership. We need more attention to policy, and not just policy announcements, but how to actually deliver policy that is transformative, and policies that are fair, and policies that are evidence-based, and policies that involve proper equality impact assessments. We can see a big example at the moment about a policy that's going wrong because there hasn't been a proper equality impact assessment. So I think what's gone wrong in the past 10 years has been poor leadership, failure to take advantage of huge opportunities that were presented in the wake of the Brexit vote and during the early years of the Johnston premiership. And so I don't think the road ahead is going to be easy, and I don't think independence will be achieved until the problems of the last 10 years are faced up to, so that we don't make them again, and that we take a different path for the next decade.
Well, for a start, I absolutely acknowledge there is a yes movement. The yes movement, as Joanna said, is made up of all the parts. We need all the voices, all the communities united in one common cause. We may have entirely and radically different visions of what we want a future Scotland to look like, but that time will come, and it won't come unless we all coalesce around common cause. So to be honest, we've been getting a wee bit vexed with stuff. We seem to have forgotten that we're in charge. It's up to us. And I often speak to people, and of course, and justifiably, because I'm still an elected MSP, they'll say, "What are you doing about this?" And sometimes I'm a wee bit cheeky back, and I say, "Aye, but what are you doing?" Because if you're sitting at home and you're typing in your computer, or you're on X, or it's always been the same game. You get out there, you educate yourself so that you can educate and inform people. You get out there, it's always been about the shoe leather. I literally never miss an opportunity to convert somebody to yes, even though we know we can't see next week there's immediately going to be another referendum or indeed another route, as Bernard said earlier.
What's interesting is these three women we've just seen all contributed very substantially to politics. I would have to say that some of the other MPs who went to Westminster in that great victory of 2015 perhaps didn't contribute quite as much as these three stars. And now we move on to one of the heroes or villains of the movement, the Scarlet Pimpernel of the referendum campaign. Is he in heaven? Is he in hell? That devil they call the Reverend Stuart Campbell.
As you will see from Rev Stu's entry into the auditorium, he was hugely welcomed and had a great time in Scotland, and you'll see from this interview why people so enjoyed his contribution both during the referendum campaign and of course at the event.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's not a bird, it's not a plane, it's not a hologram. He's here in the flesh, the Reverend Stuart Campbell, Wings Over Scotland. You're thinking about the period since the referendum. I mean, one of the things that attracted many, many people to Wings as a site was your debunking of the unionist media. And, you know, I would say superbly done, and particularly the exact analysis of where stories were coming from and the genesis and that. But you've moved somewhat, right, we could applaud that because that's absolutely right. You've moved, I would say it'd be fair to say, over the last decade to debunking the SNP government a fair amount. Do you think they've overcooked it? You've overcooked that. You think you know, certain issues like, well, self-identification would be the key one of so kind of irritated you that it's been impossible to see beyond that?
No, I mean, in terms of the way that we've shifted, I just go where the truth is. And if there is, I go where, or maybe better put this, I go where the falsehood is. I go after falsehood. I really don't like falsehood. I'm an old school journalist in that respect. But I think I've been fairly unambiguous in Wings in the last year or two in saying that I really do, and all due apologies to the panel members here who are still in the SNP, but I think the only way of progressing the independence movement now, the campaign for independence, is the destruction of the SNP. And therefore...
I should say, don't worry, they're not walking out. That's the next panel.
I was wondering myself. It's a bit dark. I can't tell who that is. But so no. To answer your question, I really believe that is what we have to do, and therefore that is what Wings is in essence dedicated to at the moment.
But I mean, you know, if a party can go in one direction, in your view, and in my view for that matter, but you know, in the wrong direction, surely it's capable of swinging back again, is it not?
I mean, in theory it is. I think you're losing the crowd here, Alex.
Well, no, Bernard said you've got to play the devil's advocate. I'm sitting beside him, so I'm playing the devil's advocate. Answer the bloody question.
I think in theory you can, but I don't think it's possible to overstate the degree of damage that has been done to the SNP in the last 10 years, and particularly by Nicola Sturgeon. Not just in terms of making it unpopular, not just in terms of pursuing dreadful, awful policies like the gender ones you mentioned, but in hollowing out the party. She drove out everybody who she regarded as a threat to her, which means there's hardly anyone competent left in the party, certainly not anybody who has any hope of becoming the leader of it. So you can interpret destruction in one of two ways. You can either interpret that as meaning obliterating the party from the Scottish electoral map so that a new party can come in and take over the independence movement, or you can take it, or you can phrase it slightly more loosely as saying destroying it as it is now and essentially building a whole new SNP from within the SNP. But I think Nicola Sturgeon consciously and deliberately damaged the party's internal structures so badly. It is not accountable to its members anymore. Its members have no say. There was one attempt to elect the good guys onto the NEC, and who were then just driven out again by Sturgeon and Morrell. And I don't think the SNP as it stands is reformable or savable, and I don't think there is anyone with a chance of being in charge of the SNP who has any interest in making any of those things.
Well, we know that those of you who had the opportunity of seeing Rev Stu in the flesh had also the opportunity to speak to him after the show. We hope he'll be back up in Scotland soon. And now we turn to the part where we interviewed press, mainstream media and television presenters in Bernard Ponsonby, John Ferguson and Kirk Torrance, who was key to the social media campaign of the SNP during the independence referendum campaign. Here's what they had to say.
I think the Daily Record had supported the Labour Party since 1955, I think. And I think that in the early years of your government, there was, there was no chance that they were going to give any credence to anything you were doing. I could remember one time, I think it must have been, I looked up, it was around 2011, you had come up with a particularly inventive policy where you were going to take proceeds of crime cash off of organised criminal and redistribute it to youth football schemes. And I can remember a senior editor in the Daily Record striding across the newsroom floor saying, how is that like, Sam? Is he coming up with this stuff in the shower in the morning? We meant to criticise this. And so I think there was, in those days, there was absolute opposition to the SNP.
Bernard, where do you think the balance of this is going, between the newspapers, television, and the online? I mean, well, let's say there was another election or referendum where the case for independence was at the touch. How do you think the balance will change next time round?
I suppose that the issue is that in circulation terms over the last 20 years is that newspapers have really been on the slide. The interesting story in terms of linear television is that although for news programs the numbers that are watching are not what they were 20 years ago, the figures are still pretty high. And any one night, in terms of the STV News at 6 and Reporting Scotland, the share on average for these programs is in the low 30s, which means that the combined viewing figures on a very good night, just depending on how many people are watching at that time, could be as high as 1 million. On a bad night, they would be 500,000. So in a sense that they still count, there's been a sort of slow squeeze in terms of linear television. I take the view that in terms of people who start podcasts or alternative sources of information, this is all to be welcomed. At the end of the day, people should have alternative sources of information and alternative sources of debate. I still think if there was a referendum in the next 10 years, whilst that social media aspect would be even more profound than it was in 2014, in terms of broadcasting, it would still be pretty important, because what in terms of the social media dynamic you do get a lot of people, and you see this not just in politics, but in football podcasts as well, people gravitate towards the point of view that they want to hear. And in any election or any referendum, it's not so much winning the converteds, it's winning the unconverteds. And I think where the unconverteds are concerned, you will still find a lot of them pretty thrilled to mainstream broadcasting, for good or for bad.
And Kirk Torrance, one of your mantras social media was keep it positive. Is that still the case, or is that even possible now in the social media that we see now?
I think it's critical, yeah. The old thing that if you have a positive campaign against a negative campaign, the positive will win. I think it's
in 2014?
Yeah, well, the one caveat there, this idea of Project Fear, I think maybe that's the one thing you remind of Hermann Goering, who at the trials in Nuremberg, he was asked, how did you get away with this? It's very easy, just make people terrified. And Project Fear, I think, is perhaps maybe the way that the opposition bursts that bubble. And if you terrify people, as well as be negative, maybe you get the edge, sadly. But I think we just have to counterbalance that more next time around.
Okay, but still keep it positive?
I think you have to keep it positive. You're basically trying to convince people that you could run their country better than its current, the status quo can. And you can't do that by being negative.
So that was a pretty strong first half of the show at the IMAX Theatre, but you ain't seen nothing yet. Join us after the break to see the fireworks of the second half of The Eyes Still Have It.
Water is life, but not all water is equal. Our water ionizer restructures and alkalizes water for optimum hydration and detoxification, recreating the planet's ultimate water sources, found in lightning-struck lakes and newly melted icebergs. H2 Pure Source. Change your water. Change your life.
Welcome back to the second half of The Eyes Still Have It. That show a month ago which took Glasgow by storm. And now I introduced at the start of the second half of the programme who I described as my two favourite politicians in the world. One male, one female. Tasmina Ahmed Sheikh and Dennis Canavan, chair of the Yes campaign. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome one of my favourite politicians, the chair of Yes Scotland, Dennis Canavan, and one of my other favourite politicians, board member of Yes Scotland, Tasmina Ahmed Sheikh. Please, Dennis.
But then, well, I was a bit disillusioned by the Wilson-Callaghan era, to say the least. And then came these long years of opposition under Thatcherism, where we were returning in Scotland, and a vast majority of Labour MPs, and yet we were able to deliver nothing because of the democratic deficit in Scotland. And going down to Westminster week after week, year after year, election after election, it was like banging your head against a brick wall. And when I was eventually elected to the Scottish Parliament, and I'd long been a supporter, all of my political life, I'd long been a supporter of the creation of a Scottish Parliament. And when I was eventually elected to the Scottish Parliament, it seemed to me that here at last we had at least a measure of home rule whereby the people of Scotland were being governed on certain issues by a government that was elected by the people of Scotland. And my main argument was that if we could deliver on important things like the abolition of tuition fees, the introduction of free prescriptions, free care for the elderly, radical land reform, if we could do these things with the devolved limited powers that we had in the Scottish Parliament, then I argued that if we had full independence, we could achieve so much more for the people of Scotland.
Although we've heard tonight from some people I greatly respect that it's not uppermost in people's minds on the doorsteps, the solution to all of these problems lies in independence for Scotland. We have to. If you knock doors and you're encountered by somebody answering their door in a big coat at winter, you have to think, this is wrong. This is our energy, our oil, our wind, all of this stuff. It makes no sense to me. So it's not our job to put things on hold. It's our job to continue the argument. And without a confirmed destination or something that people are working towards, it just seems like a question that's in the air. The referendum and the date of the 18th September gave people a destination. It encouraged people to think about what they would do on that date. We have to be in the same position now, this time round. There should be a convention now. There should be a meeting of the great minds in the independence movement. There should be no nonsense about I'm not going to share a panel with X, Y, and Z. Not if you believe in independence. If you believe in independence, you bring on board absolutely everybody who has that at their heart and soul, and take all of their messages from that. And I believe, like you, it'll come as no surprise given that I chair the Alba Party, the electoral test must be 2026. And it must be the list vote. We must say to people, if you're voting for whatever that might look like on the ballot paper for independence, then independence shall be so declared and negotiations with Westminster shall begin. Because what are we waiting for until there's nothing left for independent Scotland to be prosperous? So suffice to say, I remain exercised and passionate about the fate of my country and the fate of my country, our country, for everyone here, our children and our grandchildren, Alex. And it's time to stop talking about it and get on with the job we were charged with doing so long ago.
Dennis.
As director of the show, and indeed producer, it was very important to me to ensure that we covered many of the people who couldn't be with us on that evening in Glasgow. And these are people who are huge losses to the independence movement, people who have passed since 2014. So in this 10-year period, we've tried just to give an inkling of the feeling and sense of feeling there was in the room for so many stalwarts of the independence movement, for whom the dream shall never die, and to whom we owe a great debt, and it is our responsibility indeed to ensure that that dream lives on. Here's just a short tribute to some of those many great, great people.
Ben was Salmond. The Scottish Parliament, adjourned on the 25th day of March in the year 1707, is hereby reconvened.
Now that part of the show would have brought a tear to a glass Eden, as my granny used to say. And then the fireworks started. I've never seen a greater contrast between the slow movement of someone to the stage, because Fergus is carrying a leg injury at the present moment. But once he got down and positioned in his chair, then the fireworks started, because Fergus Ewing demonstrated he really is a chip off the old block.
You're a better historian than me, but I think it was it Bernard de Linton who was the author of the Declaration of Arbroath, and he said it wasn't for glory or for honour or for riches, but for freedom that we fight. And I must admit, of late I've noticed that many of my colleagues in their public discourse, in their pitch to persuade people for independence, they say things like, "Oh, I don't want independence for itself." Well, I do. I do. I want countries to be independent, to choose their own government, as Stu said earlier. And that's something that's astonishing. We lost very recently a fine man and absolutely engaging, charismatic character, Ian Lawson, who came to us from the Tories, and I think Celia is here. And my goodness, Ian was a great man and a tower of strength in the campaigning. And I just wanted to mention this wee vignette, that it was he and Gil Patterson, Alec, that made a certain vehicle famous in and around before, I think, Bernard, the Govan by-election. It was a converted milk cart. It probably had no MOT, certainly no road tax, but it was bloody effective because it would trundle around the schemes, and Jim Sillars and Alec, yourself, and everybody else would stand in the back and give it laldy to every single part of that constituency. Cost £0, 0 pence. They didn't need a camper van in those days, did they? And you know, can I make a serious point? I'm allowed to, Alec.
I thought these were the serious point. On you go, of course. Who am I?
Well, I did want to make a more serious point, and if you can just sort of put on disguise and go to the newsagents, buy the Mail on Sunday tomorrow, you'll see this argument set out in 1,200 words, I think they gave me.
In deference to John, we'll have to buy the Sunday Mail and the Mail on Sunday.
Yeah,
yes.
well, the cash for access story in the Sunday Mail.
You heard it here first, folks.
Anyway, I'm allowed to do that, John. I think it's probably just about hitting the press. But what was I going to say? Oh, yes. Yeah, a serious point. What are you all laughing at?
You've just revealed the Sunday Mail exclusive for tomorrow.
Hey, listen, I've only got 4 jokes.
You have now said.
No, the serious point is this, that, you know, it was said earlier that the SNP is in the doldrums, and it is. And I'm afraid the reasons for that is that their slogan was "Put Scotland First" for many years, and that means putting the people first. And what have we done? What have we said to all workers? What you're doing is wrong, it's sinful. What have we said to farmers? We know how to farm better than you. Good luck with that one, right? I was farming minister for 5 years. Good luck with that one. What about our fishermen? We're going to ban you from the seas. My mother would be turning in a grave if she'd seen that. She would. And the serious point is this, that the SNP, after the biggest drubbing in its history, since at least 1979, is in a state of complete denial. It's in intensive care. It thinks it's got a nosebleed. And, you know, until the dark shadow of branch form and why there was a tent outside our former First Minister's house, and everybody is entitled, absolutely entitled to the presumption of innocence. Nobody believes that. more than me and every other person here.
Or me, for that
But-
matter.
Hey, look, I'll get on to you in a moment. Just be a wee bit patient. I was coming to you. But seriously, until these questions are answered, where did the 600,000 quid go? Eh? What happened to the referendum money? And why did a political party need a camper van, a top-range camper van in the first place? What happened? Now, the reason I'm asking these questions is these were the questions that were being asked in the doorstep. And these are some of the questions why people didn't vote SNP. And our leadership are pretending it didn't exist. And they've got a nosebleed.
Now, we thought it was hugely important for the event and indeed the movement to take an insight into what the young people of Scotland thought then and are thinking now. So we spoke to Christina first, who was, of course, around 16 or 17 at the time when Alex introduced the right for 16 and 17-year-olds to vote, and we asked her what that experience was like for her. And then we moved to Lena. Now, Lena is a star of Broxburn Academy. Indeed, she's recently won with a team of people the World Schools Debating Championship for Scotland. Let's hear from both Christina and Lena, what insightful young women they are. And do you think the Yes campaign and all of the groups did enough to engage with young people in 2014?
I think so. I remember we had Generation Yes, and I remember, to me it felt like with the referendum and the campaign, it was on people themselves to start up groups and create the discussion. So we started up, I'm from the Borders, we started up Scottish Borders Youth for Yes, and we had support from the Yes campaign and Generation Yes, but it was something we ran ourselves. And there's actually a YouTube video you can watch, it's still there, I checked. I look much younger than I do now. And it's the Scottish Borders Youth for Yes. We did a tour and we went around the borders and we visited different kind of monuments and different areas of the borders, and we had young people speaking at these different areas about why they were voting yes. And I remember we had no issue with finding young people from these different areas to get involved. And so yes, we had the support, but we also had the momentum. Young people wanted to do things, they wanted to be active.
And was it exciting going into to cast your votes?
Oh, it was so exciting. I took a long time. I checked my vote like 5 times to make sure I put it in the right box.
So I think that young people are aware of what's going on with politics, but at quite a basic level. So I say that they don't research as much about policies. They maybe know about what's happening with each party, but they don't know as much in depth. I think that social media obviously plays a big role in the life of a 16-year-old now, TikTok and Instagram and X. And I think that is where they get quite a lot of their news from and quite a lot of their knowledge on politics from. But I think that it gives quite a one-sided view for people. So I think that the problem is if with algorithms on these social media platforms, if I like one video about Kamala Harris from the recent presidential debate, I will just get bombarded with videos about this debate from Kamala's side. And I think what this creates is quite a tunnel vision view, quite a one-sided view. And from my perspective as a debater, I think it's quite important for people to understand both sides, to be able to have respectful conversations and to be able to discuss things in a kind way. So I think that young people are engaged, but if they are engaged, it's quite at a basic level. But I also think that young people are mostly involved when there's big things happening, when it's election time, because there's lots of discussions going on, it's a lot in the news, people are discussing it around them. So I think where the gap lies with young people engaging with politics is between these elections, because they don't feel as though, I think that quite a lot of young people my age don't feel like parties listen to them and represent them. I don't think that they feel as though they listen to their views. There's quite a lot of policies going on right now with phones in schools and uniform, and it affects every one of our lives, but we aren't exactly consulted on this. Our opinions aren't exactly asked on them. And I think what would really help is actually having our opinions heard, because at the point at which we feel represented, I think young people my age would be more likely to be engaged in politics and actually learn more about it.
On that point,
And then for the knowledgeable among you, we had the Respice Prospice section. That is, look backwards, look forwards. Bernard Ponsonby assumed his usual position in the interviewer's chair, interviewed myself and that firebrand of Scottish nationalism, Alec Neil from Ayr Academy.
If I were the First Minister, I would actually, if I were John Swinney, I would bring in Alex Salmond, the Greens, the other independence organisations. There's 21 non-party political organisations who support independence. I would bring them in and work out how we're going to work together to, first of all, ensure there's a pro-independence majority in 2026. This is where I disagree with Stuart. If you destroy the SNP, you have no chance of getting the majority.
Electoral arrangement?
Electoral arrangement, yeah, absolutely, the full thing. Ideally, a core policy platform, and that would be part, though, of a wider agenda. Because the reality is, and the reason why we get the overall majority in 2011 was because people, first of all, liked the personnel who were running the Scottish Government at the time. They regarded them as totally competent, knew what they were doing, they were ambitious for Scotland, and they were stretching the powers of devolution to the absolute limit for the people of Scotland. And the second thing was we had a clear policy we had a clear policy on industry, we had a clear policy on health, we had a clear policy on education. We knew what we were trying to do and how to deliver it. That competence has gone. The reputation for competence has gone. So there needs to be in the government, as well as bringing in the wider movement, there needs to be a change of personnel in government and a clear policy. I think there are two mistakes being made by the SNP leadership in relation to... Only
two?
The second one's got two parts, though, Alex. So the first thing is, don't believe that you cannot beat the Labour Party in 2026. Keir Starmer might end up being the best thing that ever happened for the independence movement the way he's going. And so we should take Labour on Labour's territory because we can beat them. Anyone who picks out pensioners to annihilate the standard of living of pensioners the way Starmer has done is very vulnerable. And this, I think, is only the start of the big mistakes that he's making. But the second point is this. Do not assume that if Labour run into bad times, all the people who switched from the SNP to Labour on the 4th of July this year are going to automatically come back to the SNP. That's not my reading of the situation at all, because so many of our previous voters are still angry with us. We're not delivering, whether it's on Grangemouth or on a whole range of other things as well. So what we have to do is not rely on those people coming back. We have got to win them back. And you win them back with a competent cabinet, a competent government, and a set of policies that people can get behind.
Well.
And just for a bit of fun, Bernard also, just towards the end of the show, decided he would do a little impersonation of Alex Neil, all in front of his wife Isabel. It was a great watch. Here's a snippet for you.
I thought you were going to ask me to do my impersonation of Alec Neil.
Go on then.
Yes,
Go on then.
He's better at me than me, by the way.
No, I don't want him interrupting me. And I just want to address the independence question here tonight. Now, my school motto was respice, prospice. And if you didn't have a good pattern of education, let me tell you, that's Latin. Now, what I can tell you about Latin and respice and prospice, by the way, it means look back and look forward, is that it never got to Ayrshire, it didn't get to Irvine in the 1970s. Because the problem with the former First Minister is simply this. She's too much respice and no enough prospice.
And now join us after the break to see what you had to say about the two-part programme. And because everybody was enjoying themselves so much at the IMAX, we ran just a tad over time. So there's one or two questions about the future which were left hanging, and Taz promised then, and now we're delivering, I'll do my best to answer the unanswered questions about the referendum.
And now to your tweets, messages and emails in response to our shows of the last 2 weeks. Shady says, Bernard Ponsonby is insightful, analytical, has encyclopedic knowledge of politics. Such an interesting and charismatic, humorous speaker. Fascinating. Gerard says, you can still take us to independence, Alex. Remember the spider. The original Dave says, I had to laugh at Joanna Cherry biting her tongue. Politicians pretty much blaming the people and not the incompetent politicians at her side. The politicians could have gave us our freedom with Brexit, but under Sturgeon, they chose not to. Shady's back again and says, superb panels and discussions. Interesting, thoughtful, insightful. Really enjoyed hearing from Dennis Canavan. Fergus Ewing especially good. Focal Hero says, well, part 1 was excellent. However, part 2 was simply off the wall superb. Having been around the SNP for most of my adult life and now totally cast adrift from them, this discussion show made me feel like I did in the good old days. I did shed a tear when I saw Stuart Pratt and Trish appear on the wee clip of Those We've Lost, but delighted that they will be remembered. Patricia says, why is it that people cannot see that Albert are the way forward for us to get independence? They seem to think that the SNP are the only party in Scotland that can, but unfortunately, the SNP are not the least bit behind the independence movement. Suzanne says, really enjoyed watching this live. Glad everyone will now get the opportunity to watch. Hoping to see more of these in the future. And finally, Z Beving says, I literally applauded Fergus Ewing at one point. Many thanks to whoever is responsible for filming and screening this. I appreciate it. Well, the answer to your question, Z, is me. And there will be more to come. And turning from your tweets, messages and emails, which please do keep sending in, we now turn to your questions on the night. In fact, all of those which we couldn't answer because time was not on our side. And I kept them all within my little gold book, which I referred to on the night, which contains all of the meetings of 2014, about which I shall write about in due course. But meanwhile, let's pose some of these questions to Mr. Salmond. Alex, question 1.
I haven't seen these questions.
No, you haven't. He literally hasn't seen these questions. So this will be fun. He wouldn't have seen them on the night either. And we're trying to relive the moment.
There, but I'll try to be quick.
Right, so let's get started. Alex, why don't we just have a private referendum and ignore Westminster?
Well, one of my plans back in the day when I was negotiating the first referendum was if Cameron had said no, we'd have held our own referendum within the competence of the Parliament. The sort of thing that Ash Regan has suggested now in her bill, which unfortunately, has been nobody else in the Parliament is prepared to support it. And I regret that because that would have been a way to break the logjam. But now I think we're focused on getting a mandate, certainly Alapa is, at the Scottish Parliament elections.
While Starmer's UK government have stated there won't be another Indy ref, we know he can't be trusted. I think current circumstances will dictate that's extremely true. If there was another independence referendum, should the franchise be revisited? And this is from, I've just seen this, Donald, who's one of my former constituents in the beautiful former constituency of Oakland South Perthshire.
Well, Donald, I think Sir Keir Starmer is more likely to freeze old people to death than he is to grant Scotland another referendum. But if there was a referendum, can the franchise be revisited? I think we should forget that the stuff that circulates about trying to identify the real Scots and only allow them. As I pointed out on the night, that would have disqualified probably Robert the Bruce if there'd been a referendum in the 14th century. I think it's a lot of nonsense. There is an argument in constitutional referendum to have a more thoroughgoing residential qualification. You have to be in the country for a year or something like that. But it has to be a civic franchise. Apart from anything else, it'd be difficult to get United Nations, which I hear so much about these days, to recognise anything that wasn't a proper civic franchise.
Thank you, Alex. Next question. Do you think that for the next Scottish parliamentary election we could unite under the Yes banner and gain independence?
Well, it's difficult in an election campaign to do that, but what you can do, of course, is cooperate on the list. I think there's only one way that you're going to get an independence majority in that next parliament, which is crucial if we're going to do anything about Scottish independence for the next while. And that is for the SNP to hold as many of its constituency seats as it can, maybe 40 or so, and for Alba or another party or a combination of parties, but I hope Alba, to break through on the list to get, say, 15% of the vote, 24 seats, and that gives you your independence majority in the parliament. One thing I could promise about Alba, however many seats we get, whether it be half a dozen, whether it be 20, whether it be 40, every single Alba MSP will be a real advocate for independence.
When were you last invited onto BBC or ITV? We need to see you more, Alex. Regards from Tom.
Well, I've now pledged I'm only going to do live BBC interviews after my recent experience in that fake documentary where I relented, agreed to be filmed by them and found they hadn't changed a bit over the last 10 years. So I'll do live pieces for the BBC. They don't invite me very often, but recently, of course, we had quite a success with the Fannings, Peter and Flo Fannings press conference about how they're taking both Westminster and the Scottish Government to court on the withdrawal of the winter heating allowance. And that was everywhere. A good thing too, and hopefully that issue will project Scottish nationalism, those who believe in independence, onto all television screens.
Alex, do you regret standing down as SNP leader First Minister so soon after the result, says Wendy from Falkirk?
Yes.
If you can keep all answers as short as that, we'll get to the end of this programme. Should the Greens vote against the budget and force an election, do you think that would help to focus the SNP on their raison d'etre, says Dave?
Well, I mean, we're a few weeks out from that vital vote, but I don't think it's in the bag for the SNP. I've noticed just in the last few days there's a bit more respect being shown to Ash Regan, and I think that's very wise if that's what's actually happening, because in these situations, I can tell you, in the minority government, you need every vote, and it's best not to be arrogant towards anyone.
What would the currency be in an independent Scotland?
I think the arguments as to where we are now overwhelmingly to launch our own currency. I think time has changed, the argument has changed, and that is now the optimum position.
What is Sturgeon's legacy, asks Chris.
Pass.
When is the next referendum?
I think this issue is now going to be decided in an election. I think we should treat the next Scottish elections as a referendum. I think the list vote, which is not a constituency vote subject to tactical voting, but a vote in principle, allows you to do that. I think we should seek a mandate and then implement it.
Which SNP politicians were invited tonight?
Well, quite a few turned up. Some didn't, but it wasn't totally comprehensive. We wanted to keep the matter focused on the question of the referendum campaign independence. But I think the cast at the IMAX, which, incidentally, why am I answering this question? You were in charge of the show. You can say who was invited.
Well, we had, as I said, Dr. Philippa Whitford, Joanna Cherry, Michelle Thompson, Alec Neil, Fergus Ewing, I think those were the main politicians from the SNP. Some couldn't come. Many were in the audience because we couldn't interview absolutely everybody. Time didn't allow. But that also means there's an opportunity for another similar event, which might be coming soon. Next question. Given the state of education in Scotland, particularly around additional support needs, how would the panel address this if Scotland was independent?
Well, it's a huge question, worthy of far better than a rat-a-tat-tat answer. I think we have to... One of my great regrets, incidentally, was not taking a more thoroughgoing look at the curriculum for excellence. It had been introduced in primary, and seemed to be working not too badly. I had doubts about it, and certainly these doubts have been fulfilled. The key thing in education is to focus on the enduring strength of Scottish education, still there, still can be revived, is to concentrate on the professionalism of the teaching profession. You must focus your education system on that great strength, which wasn't unique to Scotland, but was very, very much a Scottish characteristic. We need to do that and provide the resources, and then we won't go far wrong.
I should say, I'm sure this question is from a teacher, because if you can see, the writing is so beautiful and so absolutely perfect.
It's not my writing, I can tell you that.
Next question. Haitians eat pets. It's just as absurd as Scotland is too poor and too small. This is from someone called Mr. Hakoma. The lying, psychotic, colonising culture is there to diminish and depress the Scottish people. Same evil culture tries to give a political decision through the court. But what, when, and what decision belongs to the Scottish people only? How do we enforce it?
Well, I thought that was a question from my old friend Donald Trump. He said, Alan, please answer that question. But I can see the very strong points that's been made.
Yes, I see we have more than one mimic in the show. Are you aware of Salvo is the next question, Liberation in Scotland, and do you think it serves a purpose to the independence movement?
I think there's a case for having movements of agitation as well as political parties. The movement can't be claimed by any single political party, nor should it be. I don't agree with all of the things that are put forward. You have to remember that the thread of Scottish sovereignty is a golden thread that's been argued by many politicians across the ages, and rightly myself among them. It's about how you put that into effect that matters. It's how do you express that sovereignty and how do you advance the cause of independence, of which going to the United Nations is certainly one aspect, but it's only one. International opinion could be crucial in the right circumstances, but only when you have a domestic mandate that you can take to the international community and say that mandate should be respected. They won't do it for us. We have to do this for ourselves.
Lee, all the way from Aberdeen, asks, what are your thoughts on free ports and special economic zones?
Well, it's a bit like the old, economic zone. I'm trying to remember what they were called. The enterprise zones, that's right. I mean, they tend to be beggar my neighbour. If you can introduce certain protections, as they have, to be fair, in the Highland Freeport in terms of a public responsible authority, then that relieves some of the great fears. Otherwise, I think you just get a situation where one area benefits at the expense of another. Incidentally, I don't see it as the same fundamental threat to sovereignty that some people do. You can always reverse it in a sovereign parliament. You can reverse anything. That's the point of being a sovereign parliament. The real theft that's going on just now is a theft of the resources in the North Sea, in particular the offshore wind at the present moment. It could be big or bigger than oil. And that's why Alapa have been advocating for some time now a Scottish share, a public share in every single offshore wind field. That's how you control the resource. The Norwegians demonstrated that many years ago in oil and gas. We should replicate that with the great new renewable resource. If we don't do that, we'll be taken to the cleaners once again.
Glenn Elder asks, do you foresee a time when those who conspired against you in a conspiracy to see you imprisoned themselves face justice?
Well, I shouldn't really comment on that except to say that, what's the words of the poet? It's coming yet for all that.
Can we make it clear to all voters in Scotland that the road to freedom via Westminster is closed? Holyrood will set Scots free.
Scots will set themselves free, and they'll do it through the vehicle of having the Scottish Parliament. Because in the absence of an agreed referendum, which doesn't look likely in the foreseeable future, then you have to have the ballot box test that won't be abolished, that will be there. That is the Scottish parliamentary elections. In particular, it's a list vote that is redolent with opportunity. If only the Scottish politicians have the audacity to put it forward and the Scottish people give it their backing. I'm reminded, and I think I quoted them recently, not at the IMAX, but recently, that the great lesson from a Scots-born Irish freedom fighter was that the great are only great when the rest of us are on our knees.
How do we overcome the narrative that all routes to independence run through institutions of the British state, asks Alan.
We put forward the concept of Scottish sovereignty, and we say that can be expressed through a Scottish parliamentary election. That argument is not going to be that difficult to overcome, incidentally, because most Scots, the majority, much more, because most Scots, the majority, many more than actually believe in independence, accept the idea of Scottish sovereignty. If you ask Scotland, where should that be decided? Who should decide the future of Scotland? Then by an overwhelming majority, people will say Scotland. They wouldn't say Westminster. They wouldn't say, Europe. They wouldn't say anything other than Scotland. So instinctively, most Scots believe themselves to be sovereign. The question is to persuade people to express it in an independence direction.
How do you build a coherent motivational vision that encompasses all of Scotland's people?
Well, firstly, get back to what Fergus said, that freedom is its own justification. Self-determination, the expression of independence is the best way to govern a country. There's no other better way. No country has prospered by allowing another country to govern it through world history. So people say, oh, well, I'm for independence because of such and such are wrong. You're for independence because that is the natural state of nations, by which you can then bring about a just, equal society, one that contributes to the international community. Now, Scotland has many faults, manifest faults, but there is an essence of being Scottish, which is something which is admirable and something which could sort out our own midden and also make a decent contribution to the rest of humanity.
Another beautifully written question. How can the Scottish people make an informed decision about our future when crucial information is hidden and distorted using laws and legislation designed to keep us ignorant of the truth?
Well, people wondered, why do I appear to have such an animus against the BBC, as opposed to all these other dreadful mainstream media groups and the rest of it? I suppose it's because, the Daily Telegraph, is what it is in the tin. You expect the Daily Telegraph to be London run, right-wing, and run down Scotland at every opportunity. That's what the Daily Telegraph, or the Daily Mail for that matter, is for. That's what they do. The BBC is meant to be a public broadcaster, giving the public information that they pay for, not a state broadcaster, which is what it is. And the fact you've got right-wing commentators, like I think it was Alec Massey, I hope I'm not doing him injustice, but I think it was, Alec Massey saying, of course, the BBC is entitled to be biased when it's the question of Scottish independence. No, it's not. A public broadcaster should be what it claims to be. The BBC are doing an advert just now saying, we're in the battle for truth across the world. But Scots will think back to the referendum campaign and say, hee-haw. And that's why I think the BBC, above any other institution, has a responsibility to live up to the position as a public broadcaster, one which it sadly manifestly failed to do.
Is there a register of ALBA members so we can form local groups?
Yes, there is. Lots of groups are formed, and we want lots more.
How might the undoubted support for independence among many Labour voters be mobilised?
Well, it was mobilised, of course, to a great extent 10 years ago and can be again. Of course, the decline of the Labour Party until very recently has been because they sided with the Tories in the referendum campaign. That's what's, better together has cost the Labour Party dear. So it's possible to do that, and we shall do it again.
Last two. Do the panel agree? But you can answer on behalf of all of them, Alex. Do the panel, including Alec Neil. Well, this is very interesting because this is from someone who signs off as granddad. Okay. Do the panel agree the Scottish Parliament needs to be reformed before the question of independence can be asked again?
I think Grandad's very wise. There are some things about the Parliament I think need reformed. I think they should look at the possibility of a second chamber now because of the weight of legislation. However, what the Parliament needs to do is have a government in the Parliament knows how to run things properly and basically not give the impression that they're interested in ridiculous things that most of the country has been mused about, and the very, very clear impression in recent years they couldn't run a tap, never mind run a country. So what the Parliament has to do, regardless of its complexion and composition, which could be improved, it has to run things properly, because that's one of the absolute essentials for our bid for independence.
And finally, we heard over the last 10 years many promises of an independent referendum which never, underlined, came to fruition. This is for all SNP politicians to answer. Was there ever a plan that you knew of?
Well, the grand old Duchess of York, she had 10,000 people. She led them up to the top of the hill and back down again. And that's what's so disillusioning about the last 10 years. It was that the claim there was going to be a referendum was always just about to happen. Headline after headline, national front page after national front page. That was a really foolish enterprise to engage in. You need a strategy. You need people to understand your strategy. You need them to believe in your strategy. That's what that was the change in the SNP from the 1990s onwards. And the national movement has to remember that, get back to it. And I say, let's do three things. Let's get an arrangement to focus on the elections of 2026. Let's secure that independence mandate by a majority of the votes and a majority of the seats in our Parliament, and then let's implement that mandate. No ifs, no buts. Let's implement it by domestic and international mobilisation. That's how we get to independence.
Thank you very much indeed, Alex. That brings us to the end of all of these questions, and thank you to all of you who attended on the night and wrote all of these questions down for us, and we hope that you get the chance to hear the answers in this week's show. And with that, we come to the end of the show, sadly, Alex.
Well, I mean, I think it's quite disgraceful. I've had to do all the work. All these people got invited along to the IMAX theatre, they got the big applause, took the bows and all the rest of it, and they hardly answered any questions at all. I had to answer them all. I want more money.
And with that, we say goodbye to all of you, and thank you very much indeed for watching. And it's an opportunity from both of us to thank all of those who participated in the show at the IMAX Cinema. It was a hugely enjoyable event. In fact, many people left feeling enthused by the whole thing, which is very, very important indeed, because we have to carry hope into the future.
And I think all of us, since I am getting more than a word in edgeways in this programme, should be asking Tasmina if she'll produce and direct another show in the near future, because I think everybody who came and everybody hopefully who's watched the show has found it an invigorating and mobilising experience.
What is it they say in show business? Watch this space. Thank you all for watching, and we hope to see you again next week, same time, same place, different subject. Until then, take care from all of us here at Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.
This is an exciting time in Scotland's story, and understanding our past will help us determine our future. And when Scotland's voice is heard, it charts the way forward. This is Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.